Thank you for joining the ISG Smart Talk, Blockchain 3.0, Demystifying Enterprise Value. Our hosts for today's talk are Alex Manders, Director, ISG Blockchain Now, and Alex Bacher, Director, ISG Research. This Smart Talk is being recorded, and a link to the replay will be available to anyone who completes our post-event survey, which you'll be redirected to at the close of this webinar. Please feel free to submit a question at any time during this presentation by using the Ask a Question box on the left side of your window. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, or if you're listening to a recording of this broadcast, we'll answer your questions in a follow-up email. With that, I'll hand things off to Alex Manders to kick off today's ISG Smart Talk.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jillian, and thank you for everyone that joined this morning, and we look forward to having a productive conversation. As Jillian mentioned, my name is Alex Paul Manders. I'm a director with ISG. I've been with ISG for almost 5 years, and I run our global ISG Blockchain Now services and solution line. And with that, I'd like to introduce Alex Bacher, who is my colleague today, who will be having a conversation with he and I throughout the course of this presentation on the topic of blockchain. So Alex Bacher, if you could take a second and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, this is Alex Bacher. As Alex mentioned, I am a director in the ISG research practice. I lead our primary research division, helping us collect market data and insights on emerging technologies. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alex. So we've got a jam-packed agenda today, and I think the key takeaway on this slide is that we want to share with you 15 to 20 minutes of content in presentation form, and then the second half of the webinar today is going to be a series of questions that Alex Bacher and I will be commenting on, and then we certainly encourage you all to submit any and all questions that you have to the chat function, so that while Alex and I are presenting the content and also having a conversation on a handful of questions, that we can begin to address specific questions that you all have, so that we can keep the conversation more interactive and more interactive and a dialogue focused. So that said, the very first thing that we wanted to cover off on is some of the blockchain market opportunity. And there's a lot of conversation in the market about how big is blockchain, what is the spend on blockchain, what are the industries that the technology is applicable to. And so what we wanted to do is just kind of level the playing field with a foundational slide to state that the blockchain market opportunity is certainly rapidly accelerating. By some cases, it's noted that blockchain spending on the technology itself has increased over 89% since last year, with estimates hitting close to $3 billion by the end of 2019. And when we think about the industries that the technology is applicable to, it pretty much is all-encompassing, from public sector to technology and media companies, utilities firms, energy organizations, automotive industry, et cetera. Within these industries are specific business processes that are common across different industries themselves. And so that's when we start to think about where is blockchain specific. If we want to pick a business process, a particular supply chain, virtually any organization, cross-industry, can define a blockchain in one way, or shape, or form. And so we believe that that's some of the reason why the blockchain spend is accelerating. And you can see some other trends and statistics on this slide. One of the key ones that I always like to call out is that an estimated 70% of the value in exploring blockchain technology in the short term is actually in cost reduction, followed by revenue generation. And so when we, as ISG, have these conversations with clients and consortial organizations and providers, it's really where can we create efficiencies by leveraging blockchain technology, whether it's software, specifically software applications in the back office, accounting, finance, supply chain, or otherwise anything that can be automated to capture an immutable audit ledger. These are the areas where clients that are looking to get started typically start with the cost reduction use cases. Alex Bacher, I want to pause and see if you've got any additional comments you'd like to make on the market sizing or industry statistics before we jump into the next slide.
Not specifically on those statistics, but something I would like to mention is that, as Alex says, this market is growing, and a big part of that is starting with use case development. We've recently completed some research for our digital assessment framework that is going to launch at some point later in the summer, in which we evaluate capabilities across a variety of enterprises to understand kind of where they're investing and where they've been successful investing in emerging technologies. And we see that blockchain is still very early on the adoption curve. Many organizations trialing and testing and trying to figure out exactly where it works for them. But we do see accelerating interest in trying to move towards production for things that are, as Alex said, reducing costs up front, and eventually towards things that create new value.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. Okay, so one of the key things that we wanted to call out were market insights, and we as ISG have been covering the blockchain space for a couple of years now, officially since last summer. But one of the key value propositions that we as ISG bring to the market is that we're heavily engaged with obviously the provider community and understanding the skill sets in that space, while also being very active in the consortia space and industry events. And so what we wanted to do was literally just share with you our perspective based on the last 4 months in Q1 of this year, some of the interesting things that we're seeing. And that really is that blockchain consortia and enterprises continue to express interest in having options in terms of sourcing technology. They're also very much interested in this concept of co-opetition models and also focusing on supply chain and designing various use cases. And so when we go and explore the consortia space, where there's estimated to be at least 90 blockchain consortia across industry, we can begin to understand that the use cases within those industries are very large. So we often hear that supply chain is a use case, or smart contracts are a use case. Smart contracts are actually an application of blockchain technology. But then when we look at the food and beverage space, they have an entirely different set of use cases as they relate to the supply chain. So, obviously they're going to come up with different use cases involved on the supply chain, but how do you track and trace strawberries grown in Mexico and link it to an IoT device to trace it through the production life cycle and ultimately end up at a Whole Foods or a Walmart? So while use cases are common at the highest level, by consortia or co-opetition models where different organizations are aligning themselves to develop private consortia, they're actively shaping use cases. In some events, they're focused on shaping use cases, as we spoke to on the prior slide, around cost reduction. So in addition to the consortia activity, we see that continuing to drive market awareness and interest within the blockchain space. We also see that the United States FDA and large retailers are now moving from a passive role to a directive role in shaping the tracking and tracing policies. And there are some key stakeholders who have moved from public organizations from private organizations to public organizations who are actively exploring changing legislation or modifying legislation to track and trace food products and pharmaceutical products through distributed ledger technology. And again, we've mentioned that supply chains remain a critical part and focal point of blockchain technologies. Food and beverage appears to be the fastest following industry related to blockchain applications. We, in the early days, obviously experienced the interest from the financial services organizations, insurance companies, banks, etc. However, when we look at the food and beverage supply chains, those are extremely large, global in nature. And when we explore legislation at the FDA level, there are likely a lot of organizations, well, there are currently a lot of organizations who are trying to solve some of the business process challenges related to their supply chains in this specific industry. And finally, I just wanted to reiterate this concept of co-opetition models and how these organizations that are beginning to develop new business models to where they can co-invest and de-risk their position in exploring a blockchain application amongst their competitors. And so when we think about food and beverage, for example, consumer safety is the number one business use case for blockchain technology. It's not using blockchain for the sake of using the technology. It's consumer safety. So every Thanksgiving, we all don't end up going into a grocery store and there's no lettuce on the shelf. That's consumer safety. And so in that industry, you're seeing a lot of retailers begin to develop models where they're sharing data across supply chains, and we're also seeing it in other industries as well. So we felt like this was a very interesting thing or set of opportunities or things for you all to be aware of. And before we transition to the next slide, I'd like to just pause and see, Alex Bacher, from a research perspective, are you seeing anything in addition, or is there anything that you'd like to comment on based on what we're discussing at this point?
Yeah, so I think a point that we need to make is in the discussion of supply chain, as Alex mentioned, supply chains look very different for many different industries, but they do have some commonalities. They tend to be collaborative to varying degrees between organizations at different stages of the supply chain itself. And they tend to require information sharing to traverse multiple different organizations that may have no contact with each other. In the case of farms, growers and wholesalers might not actually ever communicate directly. They may always be operating through intermediate shippers and distributor organizations. And so what you see in the blockchain is a kind of a tool to help recognize that supply chains don't have a natural owner of all of the information generated in a supply chain process for any given product. And one of the things that blockchain really helps with in that situation is managing distributed ownership of the technology to create that, co-opetition model that Alex was talking about, so that organizations don't have to centralize all of their data within one member of the organization who may not be able to maintain a relevant system for every use case in the supply chain.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. So we'll go ahead and move along. And one of the interesting things that we're continuing to see is that as clients in both the public and private sector gain awareness of blockchain, they're starting to see many different things. They're starting to finally see this whole evolution of blockchain consortia that we've talked about. And so they're trying to understand, where do they fit in? Is there a specific consortia that they should be aware of that's developing a use case that may be applicable to their specific industry or business? And then they also are seeing the technology provider landscape. Who are leaders in insurance blockchain use cases? Who are leaders in food and beverage? And they're trying to understand how does the technology provider community align back with this blockchain consortia community, and what are ultimately the short and long-term applications that they should be exploring. But then they also have to understand the technology capabilities side of this equation. And I think many of you on the phone have heard of your SAPs and your Amazons and your Oracles, et cetera, who are announcing different services and solutions into the market, and then also, your various organizations that are developing distributed applications and smart contracting vehicles. And so what we try to do is, with clients, to help them understand all three pieces of this pyramid to help get them along the blockchain journey. Because what we as ISG see are, in some cases, an organization will join a blockchain consortia that might have a key technology provider involved, but not really understand that there are other providers and use cases in the market that they should be aware of that could ultimately assist them in the same way that a consortia is assisting them or with other use cases that they're interested in exploring. So we're starting to demystify this approach to understanding the landscape and the frameworks that every one of these different organizations is rolling into the market. And so with that, again, the key takeaway that we would call out is that there's countless use cases being conceptualized, specifically in the consortia space, and where we see opportunity are beginning to bring some of these conceptual ideas to life through actual technology applications. And so that said, Alex, I'm not sure if you had anything you wanted to bring from a research perspective on what you see the providers doing. I know ISG has the IPL report that has recently come out with blockchain in it. Just going to pause and let you see if you've got anything you'd like to comment on.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the Provider Lens report on blockchain technologies, and I think that's a great place to start as a research for anyone on the webinar to follow up on what the service providers are doing in this space. But again, I think this speaks to the early phases we are in development of the blockchain market. Service providers are developing toolkits to help create blockchain applications quickly at this point, and are building out kind of preliminary use case kind of models for customers who are looking to get a blockchain into production to start testing. I say production, but maybe into a test environment where they can operate kind of and see what things they need to change about the technology itself and what things they need to change about the data approach. It's still early days here, but as Alex said, and as we pointed out, a big important part of a blockchain is facilitating collaboration. So getting a technology model assembled and beginning to test it with peers in your industry is kind of where the important kind of first steps are going here right now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. All right. And so one of the other ways that we as ISG, in working with our client organizations in terms of demystifying the complexity here is through a 4-step distributed blockchain ecosystem. And typically this slide would read left to right with the squares building on top of themselves, where blockchain is the foundational layer. So we begin by literally saying blockchains are networks, they're decentralized ledgers. There are many blockchains in the world that are being produced from both a public and a private and a federated perspective. However, it's just important for organizations to understand the basics of a blockchain network and just be aware that your Ethereum network is different than an IBM network, that's different than an R3 Corda network, for example. And we really, depending on who the stakeholder is, we don't get much deeper than that. It's to say, consider it as a world wide web of value as opposed to a world wide web of information. But more importantly, when we start to talk about the capabilities of blockchain, we layer on the fact that it's a development platform. So you can build storage and infrastructure applications on top of blockchain networks. And then when you have that storage and infrastructure layer, you can add on smart contract applications and then ultimately distributed applications. So in some of the ways that we explain it, we think of the world wide web of information, the killer application that drove the adoption of the World Wide Web was email. And once that network was established, the way we know it today, we saw it evolve with email applications, and then we saw it evolve with different websites, and then ultimately software applications. Now we see all kinds of things on our mobile phones, et cetera, but we as consumers or enterprises typically don't really ask too many questions about the supporting architecture underneath it. And so when we drive our conversations, we want to make sure that our organizations simply understand that blockchains are different, and here are the key differences that you should be aware of. Here, once you have a blockchain network that you have selected, that you can build applications on top of it. And one of the key killer applications of the blockchain is smart contracts, which facilitate automation, log data, and immutable ledgers, begin to drive operational efficiencies in both internal and external audits, regulatory filings, supply chain contracts, et cetera. But really, this is how we approach it. And we are starting to see one of the biggest challenges being solved at this point, which is cross-chain interoperability. So if we think about blockchains as individual networks, let's begin to think about how do we connect those individual blockchains. One of the questions we get often is, what is the best blockchain? Who should I pick? Why should I pick that? And if I pick it, what do I have to be aware of in the future? Or am I going to have to pay higher transaction processing costs? Am I going to have to pay a software as a service cost, right? So while we may say that we're in the early days of blockchain, I think we may also position that as we are in the early days of solving cross-chain interoperability. And once cross-chain interoperability is fundamentally resolved from a technical perspective, it will ultimately enable organizations and consumers alike to develop various applications on top of them that have and support various use cases. So that said, Alex Bacher, let me turn it over to you and see if you've got anything you'd like to add.
Well, actually, in a kind of discussion format, I'm reminded that about a year ago, you and I were talking about what we expected the phases of the blockchain market to look like as it kind of evolved. And one of the first things we discussed was that in the initial kind of enterprise uses of blockchain, we really looked at distributed applications as being kind of the major beachhead for where companies would start. And that is proven to be true. Organizations have started looking at where are the cases where a collaborative environment, especially collaboration of data transfer between organizations, needed to be solved in a way that didn't require any one party to centrally own the data. And kind of where we see this going, I think, is away from just a decentralized application to a way of using a decentralized application in managing many more data sets. So looking at all the data that a blockchain might touch, well, not every piece of data in your data warehouse is going to end up on a blockchain. But what you may do is store information like metadata about your data warehouse on a blockchain so that you have awareness between parties of what information is available versus what information is actively being shared. And, I think we called this kind of next wave coming after distributed applications a trusted data system. And we were kind of talking around identity management, more kind of trust continuity across existing systems as another potential development wave past just the distributed applications. Have you seen any discussions of that recently?
So yes, we have. I think where a lot of this is still being sorted out is on the use cases that can actually facilitate the data transfer between organizations outside of their four walls, so to speak. And that's really important when we think about just the exchange of data. In the cross-chain interoperability topic that we briefly mentioned. Once organizations solve that master data management, quote unquote, challenge within blockchain applications, then we'll start to see that whole distributed ecosystem of organizations sharing various pieces of data that are extremely decentralized and highly secured. So Alex, does that resolve the question, or was there something else that you might see or curious about what we were seeing in the market?
No, I think that's right. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, so we'll move along here to the use cases, and again, we've already mentioned several of these, and just wanted to reiterate. On the ERP side, we're starting to see very forward-thinking organizations ask the question: do we need to make heavy investments into our ERPs, or do we have options? And in some cases, we're seeing organizations begin to extract data out of their ERP systems and creating decentralized applications that they can then share information with other organizations who are doing the same thing. So ERP extracts up into the air quote blockchain cloud that they can then share between themselves. We're starting to see some thinking around there, which is highly interesting. And then obviously supply chain, which we've spoken about on several cases already. And again, it's the audit trail and the product recalls that's important when we start to think about supply chains. And even when we think about supply chains in industries that you might not traditionally think has a supply chain, like insurance, you can create a data supply chain. And this kind of talks about Alex Bacher's comment or question on the prior slide is, you know, if we write a homeowner's policy to Alex and or Alex Bacher, the risk is ultimately transitioned all the way back to Lloyd's of London, right? So we have data and risk supply chains. We have traditional supply chains of product movements, et cetera, which is a very big area to explore. But then finally, blockchain and IoT. A lot of organizations are curious about linking IoT-connected devices back to their blockchain decentralized networks. And again, this is important when we think about product recalls, tracking, tracing of shipments, et cetera. You naturally got to have a mechanism to capture that information, and it typically starts at the IoT device, but then you want to keep that device's information secure. So how do you do that? You obviously want to share that information with other parties in the value chain. How do you do that? And so those are some of the areas where we're starting to see a lot of innovation and experiment occur. So Alex Bacher, anything you want to add to this slide in terms of different high-level use cases that are being explored?
No, but I think the important point in there is that it is not mandatory that every piece of data be stored in the blockchain. And you know, as Alex said, the master data management problem is kind of the primary one that can be solved with a blockchain. It's not mandatory that you replace a relational data store with a blockchain. It's more an additive solution that improves certain collaborative features of the network.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, when we have a lot of these conversations, there's still just a lot of confusion around if we put data into a blockchain application, who can see it? And I'm concerned that someone else might see my data that they shouldn't see. Well, when you set up the application, when you develop the application on a specific network, you can define those rules and parameters to ensure that, you know, I'm just using a high-level use case that, you know, maybe Target only sees the farmer that supplied them with the strawberry, not the field that the strawberry was grown in, or the distributor that packaged the strawberry and sent it to Target as a retail outlet. So you can essentially define the rules and requirements around data and who sees it and who owns it. And those are also a lot of the questions that we see, or how do you do that? And it's not unlike many of the questions that you would typically have a conversation around in terms of master data management or security around any application within an enterprise otherwise. So that said, Alex, before I move to the next slide, any other thoughts?
Yeah, it's, you know, another great example in the IoT would be, is an IoT device reporting data? Is it operating? You might examine this for like a cold chain application where the group on the blockchain does not need to know actually what temperature is being reported every second, but they do need to know that the device was working and reporting temperatures within range during the entire period that it was tracking a shipment, for example. So, you know, there's also a kind of defense mechanism for the IoT, which is that IoT devices can generate a large amount of data, and you don't necessarily need to support all of that data being on the blockchain from a volume point of view. You can kind of reduce that down to reduce the kind of operational overhead of sharing that much information directly.
Very good. Thank you, Alex. We're going to continue along here in terms of what ISG are working with our clients on. So many of you are aware of ISG's Future Source products and our ISG Provider Lens products. That we as ISG have a very defined methodology and process framework that we've leveraged for a number of years, and through the sourcing and research combination, which includes our consortia analysis, we're able to help clients obviously source technology, provide them with fact-based research to make educated decisions on designing use cases, and ultimately get them started through their blockchain journey. Where this is extremely valuable is that in many cases, if you run Google searches, as silly as that sounds, you're going to get a lot of mixed information about what is going on in the market. You're going to get different research perspectives that might not be fully supported with facts. And where we're trying to help drive the market forward is executing what we as ISG have done historically through our research products and our sourcing products and frameworks to help clients make the best decisions that they can, because we, along with the providers and the consortia and all interested parties in this space, we want to see the market evolve and move forward and be successful. So we're simply saying here, we're now deploying several of our proven methodologies back into the blockchain space specifically in order to address many of the questions that were being asked. And so, Alex Bacher, you're on the research side. I'm not sure if you have anything you would like to comment here.
No, but the effort is being made to tie what we are helping clients achieve from an advisory point of view back with the research and showing kind of what is important for helping differentiate the technology partners that clients are leveraging and their own outcomes. So again, I referenced our Provider Lens study earlier. The US report on blockchain was published in February, and we have done other regional reports on blockchain technologies kind of coming out over the last several months. So if anyone is interested in those reports, please contact us and we can help you access those.
Fantastic. And so in the benefit of time, and so that we can transition over into a dialogue around a handful of questions, we simply just wanted to outline on the slide for those of you that complete the survey, et cetera. You'll see this in greater detail. But ISG are very much interested in collaboration with the provider community to co-solution applications with our clients. And you can see at the very bottom how this is a build upward. We as ISG come in, we help shape the use cases, provide market intelligence, and ultimately help clients get to that point of developing the business cases and sourcing the technology, and then ultimately help them operationalize and support the deployment of the application within the enterprise environment. And to the right, you'll see where the technology provider capabilities come into play. We are actively running ISG sourcing blockchain or ISG blockchain sourcing workshops, design sessions, et cetera. And you'll see here where we're very much interested in trying to bring the provider community into our blockchain conversations to help benefit the clients and drive the market forward. And then finally on slide 11, this is a use case that ISG developed for a manufacturing client. It's specifically related to digitizing elevator components so that we could create an immutable audit log of the supply chain movement of a specific part to the point of implementation, and then to the point of also tracking the parts life cycle within the elevator space. So again, this is something that once we or you all are able to fill out the survey, you take a read through it and let us know of any comments or questions after the fact. And so that said, I'd like to now move into the questions here. And Alex, let me go ahead and position the very first of three questions that we had chatted about, and that being, what is the value from your perspective? What is the value proposition for organizations exploring blockchain technology?
Right. So, I think we've kind of discussed a lot of angles around kind of this central choice, which is that there are business processes that have no natural single owners. Businesses are becoming more specialized and more collaborative. They work with an increasing array of suppliers, and they've taken the view that it's better to have a peer group in a supply chain that each specializes on different components of the service. And there are some natural inefficiencies with data sharing and the ability to reuse information across those kind of relationships that blockchain helps to solve. Obviously, technologies never solve business problems if the businesses aren't willing to change some processes and some of their own practices. But the blockchain proposes a technology solution to help overcome some of the key technical hurdles that have prevented businesses from sharing information in a collaborative way before.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alex. And I want to respond and say that I would agree with you on all those points, and maybe even extend it a little bit further and say that one of the primary value propositions for organizations to explore blockchain is that business process reengineering. So when we start these conversations, we can typically say, what are your top 4 strategic goals, right? And then you start to look at those strategic goals and then drive a little bit lower or double click down and say, okay, well, how can we achieve these strategic goals by reengineering business processes? Are there business processes that could be or otherwise present an opportunity for improvement, and can we improve a business process to support a strategic initiative by leveraging technologies inclusive of blockchain? So I think that this whole concept of let's just have an honest conversation with ourselves as an organization. We know these business processes could be fixed. What are we capable of doing by fixing them from a business process perspective, and what kinds of technology applications can we develop, I think is a huge value proposition. I think the other one is competitive advantage. We often read various bits and parts of research that indicate that two CIOs out of 2,000 say that they've explored blockchain. I'm just making up a statistic. It's not a real statistic. But when we start to read things like that, we begin to question what competitive advantages that are being explored within other parts of the business outside of IT. Throughout this presentation have highlighted that many of the use cases are coming out of supply chain and logistics. And so we're seeing value of specific use cases that's carrying outside of IT. And so we see that blockchain is not always an IT discussion because it's very much a business discussion. And then we also see the value proposition being around innovation. What can we do to just, in general, increase the efficiencies within our organization to drive next generation competitive advantages, and how can we also innovate and develop new co-opetition models with our competitors, right? So those are some of the value propositions that we see. Alex, any questions or comments based on what I just mentioned as well?
Yeah, so a follow-on comment is, I think, as you look at the markets for emerging technologies over the last decade, one of the things that is apparent is that this business process reengineering has been kind of at the heart of many of our major technology transitions. From migrating applications to the cloud, where early versions of cloud applications had value but lacked configurability. So organizations that were really keen to take advantage of the cloud had to re-engineer their existing processes to match what was available from the cloud vendors. All the way to things like, DevOps and continuous delivery, able to leverage on-demand servers and, compute resources on infrastructure as a service providers. Business process changes with emerging technology. And I think, as Alex said, organizations that are really willing to have that conversation of how can our business process change given what the technology has made available, those are the ones that are going to be more successful going forward.
Right, and I would agree with that as well. So, Alex Bacher, let's move to the next slide, and let me go ahead and position this question with you. What types of benefits are organizations anticipating from blockchain?
So it's starting with the efficiency. So you mentioned cost savings as being a place where companies are looking. They're going to realize those cost savings through improved efficiency of communication and the lack of having to the lack of information in the current systems that costs money in other ways. So again, you think of parts recalls and food recalls, where because of the lack of transparency in the supply chain, you have to recall not all the lettuce from, a single farm, but all the lettuce from a single week, because you don't know where it all went. You could think of individual parts that had, specific bad lot numbers, but you don't know where they were all distributed to. In eliminating systems like that and replacing them with much more granular data, that data drives efficiency and cost savings early on. And that's where I think we're going to see a lot of the benefits in the short term. In the long term, I think we'll start seeing benefits that accrue from having improved trust across systems, so that businesses making decisions that require authentication and consistent identity across multiple businesses, can be more sure that a decision is honest and more sure the decision is coming from the party they think it's coming from.
Yeah, I'll echo that as well on the point of cost reduction in terms of short-term benefits, because that's usually what we're seeing the easiest way to fund an innovative product. Some organizations have innovation budgets, while others are, they either have to fund the experiment with blockchain from their own budget, or they've got to get budget from IT. And so it's easier to build a business case when you can demonstrate that some sort of cost benefit can be realized through a reduction within a specific process. So I would agree with that, Alex. Some of the other things that you mentioned that I would agree with wholeheartedly are food safety and pharmaceutical safety. One of the things we see in the pharmaceutical supply chain space are there's at least one consortia that represents nearly $1 trillion worth of organizations that are in the pharmaceutical supply chain, and a lot of the benefits that they're hoping to achieve are from accounting things such as chargebacks and showbacks, but consumer safety, product recall. We've seen in the news the past couple of months about various things related to pharmaceutical products that revolve around medical marijuana and some other things that, when those things don't get returned, well, you have a lot of theft, right? And so these organizations are looking to prevent fraud and better track and trace the origin of product back to the point of manufacture, so that, to Alex, your point, we don't have to recall 2 months worth of pharmaceutical product that was manufactured at a specific point in time. We might only have to recall 2 days, right? And so we were better able to do that through a combination of IoT smart connected devices that track and create that transparency across the value chain to hopefully drive consumer safety for all those on the phone, including the presenters. And the same applies to food. I also think that based on our conversation, some of the other benefits are around IoT scalability. We often hear of big data and cognitive and artificial intelligence, and when we start to think about distributed ledgers and cross-chain interoperability, we can then begin to really get our minds around what is big data, what does it really look like when it's not harnessed within the four walls of an organization, what does it really look like when you can start to share it with other partners in your value chain, and what are some of the benefits that can ultimately be achieved through cognitive applications and artificial intelligence in a decentralized network? Are we then able to really scale IoT smart connected devices that process microtransactions at the fraction of a cent level so that we can begin to explore the concepts of smart cities and some of these other very emerging topics that we often hear about as technologists? And I know, Alex, AI and IoT are things that are of particular interest to you. I'm not sure what other comments you may have on the topic of linking big data to scalability in the blockchain space.
Yeah, so I think you kind of touched on it. Is there's a lot of data that does not get shared because once you've shared it, there's kind of no going back. There's no knowing where it ends up. And I think that's a key use case, especially as you consider developing, AI models, or you consider developing, smart devices that need to take specific action based on specific data. Is how can you share that data or those models between parties, knowing that you've kept the information secure and safe? I think that's another place where we'll see blockchains in the future. Again, going back to this concept of trusted data systems that are just now starting to emerge.
Fantastic. All right. So, Alex, let's move to our third question here, and we'll kick it off with you. So, what are some of the obstacles organizations should consider when getting started with shaping blockchain use cases and identifying technology solutions?
Yeah, I can't say strong enough that ensuring that your organization is aligned internally from a process and a data and an objectives point of view before going to try to create those collaborative environments with peers in the market or peers in your supply chain is really important. So an obstacle you might face is that while you may have a business case, there are requirements that prevent you from sharing certain data. There may also be data you would like to have that your partners are not able to give you. And so you have to see, is the use case actually viable given kind of regulatory or client commitments with your data? Another obstacle is understanding where the benefits will accrue in your organization. Is this a benefit that's going to be primarily driven towards IT, but which would require a lot of effort and process change in your supply chain operations team? Understanding where your benefits and where your where your requirements are being driven from. Those are going to be some first obstacles that organizations need to get at when they're designing the use case.
Yeah, I would echo that as well, and also comment on, some of the obstacles that we also see are identifying who in the organization is doing what, and this builds off of your stakeholder alignment comment. We've seen organizations that will publicly say that they're not doing blockchain, but we then see within their organization offline that they've got, a couple of different projects going on in parts of the business where those parts of the business didn't even know that another part of the business was working on blockchain. So that all goes back to this idea that if you lead in with business first, align it to a strategy, and then support it with an ROI model and then the blockchain experiment, then you will actually discover use cases that are not only applicable in finance and accounting. There's use cases in supply chain, ERP, all these things that we've talked about today. So I think one of the big obstacles is trying to figure out who is doing what, who is funding what do the stakeholders involved understand. We still see where, you'll go and have a conversation about blockchain and a CFO will perhaps refer to it as Bitcoin, right? And while we're almost out of that thinking of crypto with blockchain, that thinking is still in the market. And so I think just making sure that an enablement or a common understanding of what it is and what it is not is very much key. I think also this discussion that we often have ourselves involved with is rationalizing the costs and benefits. And that's a key obstacle because if we don't understand what it is we're trying to do from a business perspective, how can we obviously support it from a technology perspective? Because until the connection is made, then can we only define what the cost benefit is, or otherwise rationalizing an investment into the blockchain experiments or innovations. And then finally, how you really measure success? You know, everybody's got a different measuring stick, so to speak. If we want to build a blockchain proof of concept for cost reduction, how do we measure success? Or are we willing to make an investment as an organization out of the innovation budget to define a new application to drive a new part of our business from an R&D perspective? So one of the other obstacles is clearly measuring what does success look like while ensuring that everyone is enabled on what that definition is, and then who in the organization is collectively aligned around the idea of building next generation blockchain applications. That said, Alex, any other thoughts that might have provoked, or comments, questions?
You know, I'll add that it reminds me a lot when you talk about not knowing about what projects are going on internally inside an organization. We see this so frequently in emerging technologies. I'm reminded back in the early days of Amazon Web Services and, you know, other cloud providers, that CIOs would say, no, we're not using the cloud at all. And then they'd get the credit card bills back and go, actually, we're using the cloud in a lot of places. And it was never clear exactly in the early days who was using what technologies for which projects, even if it was just dev and test machines. And, you know, we see that pattern repeat across, you know, enterprise social networks, many of which were started by just signing up and starting to use them. And we're seeing that in blockchain too, is that organizations are exploring use cases in small pockets with small teams. And we're not yet in the stage where every organization has a full handle on where and why those are being developed.
Wonderful. So Alex, it looks like we've got about 3 minutes or so left before we hand it back over to Jillian for close. We've got a couple questions here. Not sure which one you might want to be, if you could, pick one and then read the question and perhaps share your thought. I think the first one there might have been one that you were interested in.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with this one from the audience here. From a capabilities perspective, who are the service provider leaders? Actually, from a deal close versus capabilities perspective, who are the service provider leaders? And I'll say that from a deal close perspective, we don't have data that we can share there. But when you think of service providers, there's a variety of ways to answer that. Obviously, Azure and Amazon have blockchain as a service offerings that support the infrastructure and the hardware to develop these networks. And so they're developing, you know, many use cases are being developed on their platforms. And from a service provider point of view, our provider lens report kind of shows the leaders in these various regions. So in the US region, for example, you know, we see providers like IBM that have invested heavily in their Hyperledger offerings and developing many business cases kind of at the high end of the leaders quadrant, along with Accenture, NTT Data, and you know, many other kind of large service provider peers.
Yeah, and I would also comment on that to say what is interesting is the evolution of specific focus on blockchain applications by industry or use case. So for example, when we perhaps go to a client in the food and beverage space and they say, hey, who are the three providers, whether it's technology capabilities or service integrator, et cetera, who can help us with track and trace of food product, we're starting to see specific use cases and industry focus come into play, which is really important because what we also see are a lot of organizations say, hey, this group doesn't understand my business. They don't understand how a harvester is different from a farmer. They don't understand, how we take data from a remote location and share it with a retailer, right? So if you're able to demonstrate that you truly understand a specific industry and a specific part of a supply chain function or use case, that's where we're beginning to see some differentiation occur. So, Alex, there's one other question in there. Not sure if you want to take a crack at addressing it, and then I could probably take a shot as well, if you'd like.
Sure. So the question is, please elaborate on understanding why blockchain in particular provides a benefit around IoT devices. And the answer I would get into here, given our short time, is that you think primarily around how you coordinate multiple devices that are generating information that is relevant to multiple parties. Obviously, there are simpler applications when you could coordinate, a bunch of like sensors with a single database, and that might be the only use case you have. But in cases of kind of mass coordination where sensors from multiple parties are connecting data to multiple different applications, if you don't want to centralize all of the data into a single database and have everyone connecting to it, because say no individual party wants to control everything, or because you need to scale it beyond the point where any one party should be managing all of that data, or because not every party needs every piece of access. Blockchains propose a solution there to solve that coordination problem without centralization. Now, I think it's worth asking yourself really if you have natural intermediaries and natural centralization in your use case. That may be less relevant in the short term. But again, we see things like smart cities not necessarily centralizing perfectly on a single manager and owner of all the data.
Yeah, and in 60 seconds or less, and I'll turn this over to Jillian, I would say if I go back to the use case that is in this deck, it's around the elevator business, and if you all have likely ridden an elevator, there are many parts in an elevator, and there are many component manufacturers of those parts. And when we begin to link IoT connected devices to those parts, you begin to facilitate the interest of transparency across building owners, repair technicians, manufacturers, to create a better consumer experience. And that consumer experience can be supported by a decentralized ledger that has all this different information collected at various points to drive that consumer experience. Because I don't know about you, but if I get stuck in an elevator somewhere, I want it repaired as quickly as possible by the nearest technician, and I would like that manufacturer of the component part to be informed to replace that part as fast as possible. So just another example of where IoT and decentralized ledgers can facilitate that type of activity. With that said, Jillian, I want to turn it back over to you for any closing thoughts or comments you may have.
All right, thanks very much. This does conclude our time today. Thank you for joining our ISG Smart Talk. As mentioned, we will be sending the replay to anyone who completes the post-event survey, which you'll be redirected to at the close of this webinar. If you would like to speak with Alex Manders, Alex Bacher, or any of our ISG advisors, please reach out to us at www.isg-one.com. Thanks very much for listening.